I want you to think about the last time you did something you were just absolutely terrified to do.
Oh, like a public speaking thing? Or?
Yeah, exactly. But not something that happened to you by accident. Not like a car swerving into your lane. I mean, something you actively chose.
Right, like quitting a stable job without a backup plan.
Yes. Or having a brutally honest conversation that, you knew might end a relationship. Packing up your life and moving to a city where you don't know a single soul.
That takes a massive physiological toll on your body.
It really does.
Yeah.
Your heart rate elevates, your stomach drops, you completely stop sleeping well, and you endure all of that discomfort, all of that anxiety, because on some fundamental level, you believe the outcome is going to be worth the suffering.
You're enduring it on purpose.
Exactly. And that distinction, that gap between accidental hardship and intentional hardship, is the cornerstone of what we are unpacking today.
Because when the brain is forced into a survival scenario against its will, the psychological mechanisms that take over are vastly different from when the brain willingly walks right into the fire.
Which brings us to the 5th installment of our special series, Depths of the Mind, the psychology of 4546B. Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone.
It's great to be back.
If you've been listening to our previous discussions, you know we've spent hours analyzing the sunlit shallows, the crushing darkness of the ocean trenches.
And of course, the minds of accidental castaways.
Right, people who just wanted to stay alive until rescue arrived. But today, we are leaving the tropics behind. We are shifting our focus to the frozen, hostile, wind-scoured surface of Sector 0 in Subnautica below zero.
A completely different environment.
Totally. And more importantly, we are focusing on one incredibly unique individual, Robin Ayou.
Robin represents just a total paradigm shift for our psychological analysis of this planet.
She really does. Because our mission today is to synthesize a massive, honestly intimidating stack of sources to understand her. We are pulling from the in-game lore of the Altera Corporation, Xenoworks, and the ancient architect aliens.
But we aren't stopping there.
No, we are layering all of that narrative data with some of the most dense, fascinating psychological literature available today.
We're talking survival psychology, the clinical mechanics of ambiguity tolerance, the neurology of post-traumatic growth.
We're even pulling in philosophical treatises on anxiety by Søren Kierkegaard.
It's a heavy stack of sources, I know, but it is necessary because Robin's situation demands a truly multidisciplinary approach.
It does. Because here is the hook for today. This is the reason Robin's story is entirely unique. Unlike Riley Robinson, who we talked about in the first game, or, the doomed Degassi crew.
Robin is on planet 4546B on purpose.
Yes. She didn't crash by accident. She wasn't just trying to keep her head above water. Today, we are exploring how grief, a massive corporate gaslighting campaign, and a literal alien roommate living inside her cerebral cortex completely redefine the mechanics of survival.
Survival, in this context, stops being about biology and really starts being about philosophy.
So let's start with the narrative fuel. What actually drives a person to sneak past an orbital blockade and intentionally crash land a cobbled-together shuttle onto an alien ice world?
Well, for Robin, it's the death of her sister Sam.
Right. Now, Altera, which is this massive, omnipresent, incredibly shady transgov corporation, they claimed that Sam died due to employee negligence during a cave-in.
A very convenient narrative for them.
So convenient. They sent Robin this sanitized, legally approved death notice, and Robin simply refuses to accept it.
And to understand why she rejects it and why she risks her life to investigate, we really have to look at the psychological concept of the search for meaning.
Let's get into that.
In the literature of extreme survival, Viktor Frankl's 1946 book, Man's Search for Meaning, is just the absolute bedrock.
Essential reading.
Truly. Frankl was a psychiatrist who survived multiple Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and he developed a psychological framework called logotherapy based on his time there.
Right, and his core observation was that survival in horrific conditions is rarely determined by just sheer physical stamina.
Exactly. The people who survived were the ones who could connect their suffering to a purpose.
But let's dig into the why of that. Yeah. Why does having a purpose keep you from literally freezing to death? Because on the surface, that sounds like a bumper sticker.
It sounds a bit like motivational fluff, yeah.
Right, but it's not fluff, is it?
Not at all. It's pure neurobiology. When Frankel observed his fellow prisoners, he noted that the exact moment someone lost their imagined future, the moment they could no longer picture reuniting with a loved one or finishing a life's work or even seeking justice.
Their bodies would literally just shut down.
Completely. The brain is essentially a prediction machine. It constantly allocates energy based on what it expects to happen tomorrow.
So when you remove the tomorrow, the brain registers that survival efforts are a waste of caloric and cognitive energy.
Yes. It triggers a massive dopamine crash. You stop fighting infections. You stop seeking warmth. Frankel called this give-up-itis.
Give-up-itis. Wow. The mind kills the body.
It does. So for Robin, surviving the freezing temperatures of Sector Zero isn't about the biological act of breathing. Breathing is just a prerequisite for finding the truth.
Right. Her sister's legacy is the tomorrow that keeps her brain pumping dopamine into her system, telling her limbs to keep moving through the snow.
I'd frame it as her psychological anchor. And this aligns perfectly with the Survivors Club topology outlined in Ben Sherwood's research, which we also reviewed for this deep dive.
Ah, yeah. Sherwood's work is fascinating.
It really is. He looks at the traits of people who survive plane crashes, being lost at sea, or extreme wilderness exposure. And two of the most powerful traits he identifies are love and purpose.
Right, because people will push their bodies far past the point of mechanical failure for the people they love.
Exactly. Robin's bond with Sam gives her this almost supernatural tenacity. It's not that she doesn't feel the cold of the Arctic spires, it's that the cold is secondary to the mission.
It reminds me of the Stockdale paradox. We read about Admiral James Stockdale in the sources.
Oh, the POW in Vietnam?
Yes. The highest-ranking naval officer held as a prisoner of war there. He was tortured routinely for over 7 years. And his mechanism for survival was this incredibly difficult cognitive tightrope.
Confronting the brutal reality while maintaining hope.
Exactly. He said that to survive, you must confront the most brutal, harsh realities of your immediate environment. You cannot pretend the torture isn't happening.
Or in Robin's case, you can't pretend a snowstalker isn't actively trying to eat you.
Right. You face that reality, but without ever losing the unwavering faith that you will ultimately prevail in the end.
The balance there is absolutely critical. Stockdale noted that the extreme optimists, the ones who kept saying, oh, we'll be out by Christmas, they were the ones who died of broken hearts when Christmas came and went.
And the pessimists just gave up immediately.
Yes. The paradox is holding stark realism and absolute hope in the brain simultaneously.
Okay, let's unpack this, because something has been bothering me as I read through these survival accounts.
What's that?
Well, usually survival is about pure, reactive, biological self-preservation. It's about narrowing your focus to just the next 5 minutes. But Robin has this highly specific external goal, solve my sister's murder.
Right.
Doesn't having a complex external goal actually make survival harder?
How do you mean?
Well, think about the cognitive load. It's like trying to run a marathon while simultaneously doing a Sunday crossword puzzle.
That's a great image.
Your brain only has so much bandwidth. You know, if Robin is freezing, starving, and being hunted by alien wildlife, her brain should be dedicating 100% of its resources to just staying alive.
But instead, she's playing detective.
Exactly. She has to remember to eat, build shelter, manage her body temperature, and analyze corporate logs, scan broken equipment, and deduce what Sam was doing. Isn't that splitting her cognitive resources in a way that should practically guarantee she makes a fatal mistake?
You're hitting on a very real biological tax there. Yes, intellectually, it demands a much higher cognitive load, and the brain consumes a massive amount of calories when it's doing high-level problem solving.
So why doesn't she fail?
Because you have to look at what that cognitive load buys her. It buys her protection against apathy.
The give-up-itis.
Precisely. If we return to Frankel's observations, he identified 3 psychological reactions to extreme captivity or survival scenarios. The first is shock, the second is apathy, and the third is depersonalization.
And apathy is the real killer.
It is. It's where the mind just goes completely numb. If Robin was only trying to survive for the sake of surviving, the sheer crushing repetition of the harsh environment would eventually wear her down.
The cold, the hunger, the isolation.
Right. It just becomes too exhausting to care anymore.
So by forcing her brain to solve a mystery, she's actually tricking herself into staying engaged.
Well, it's not a trick, it's a structural framework. Having an external goal gives the brain a highly logical reason to keep the body moving. Furthermore, it forces the survivor to utilize what Lawrence Gonzalez in his book Deep Survival calls the STOP method.
Sit, think, observe, plan.
Exactly. When you are just reacting to the environment, you panic. When you have a complex mission, you have to break impossible tasks down into small, manageable steps.
Right. Robin isn't just wildly running from predators. She's executing a systematic investigation.
She needs to build a scanner. That's one step. She needs to locate a sunken base. That's another step.
The goal of finding Sam provides a rigid architecture to her days. It prevents that paralyzing despair that kills isolated survivors, because every action, no matter how small, is a victory against the environment.
That structure is so important, especially when you consider what she's actually up against. We really need to transition from Robin's internal motivation to the external human obstacle she faces.
Yes, because the weather isn't her only enemy. She is fighting a massive, orchestrated corporate cover-up. Altera is just the ultimate unreliable narrator in this story.
And they are a formidable psychological adversary.
Very. As Robin investigates, we find out that Altera was secretly mutating the Kara bacterium at a covert underwater facility called Omega Lab.
The same bacterium that nearly wiped out the planet in the first game.
Exactly. And Altera wanted to weaponize it. Sam discovered this, panicked, and realized she had to stop them. She synthesized an antidote, hid it in some spy penguins, and then blew up a cave containing a frozen Leviathan that was infected with the bacteria.
But she died in the ensuing blast.
Right, and Altera sweeps the entire thing under the rug, labels it employee negligence, and just acts like nothing happened.
This narrative introduces one of the most compelling psychological dynamics of the entire deep dive, which is ambiguity tolerance versus intolerance.
This is fascinating.
It is. This is a concept formally introduced by psychologist Else Frankel-Brunswick in 1949. To understand this, we need to define how the brain handles ambiguity.
Which arises when we are presented with information that is unfamiliar, conflicting, or when there is simply a void of information.
Yes. And as a rule, human beings absolutely despise ambiguity. We want answers.
We hate it because our brains are wired to predict the immediate future to keep us safe.
Exactly. When the brain encounters an ambiguous situation, it can't run a predictive model. It doesn't know if the shadow in the bushes is a tiger or just the wind, so it triggers a stress response.
It floods the body with cortisol.
Right. Individuals who are intolerant of ambiguity experience severe anxiety. They interpret ambiguous situations as immediate threats, and to cope with that intense physiological discomfort, they rush to premature, simplistic closures.
They will rigidly adhere to an inaccurate or incomplete interpretation of events just to make the anxiety stop. I want the listener to really picture this in their own life. Imagine you get a text from your partner that says, "We need to talk," and then they completely ghost you for 24 hours.
Oh, that is the worst feeling.
It is. Your brain starts filling that informational void with the absolute worst possible scenarios. You get that suffocating, tight feeling in your chest, that dread.
That is the intolerance of ambiguity in action.
Exactly. Now, imagine that feeling stretched over months, isolated on an alien ice planet, knowing a mega corporation is lying to you about your dead sister.
If Robin were intolerant of ambiguity, she would have cracked. She would have accepted Altera's official report just to relieve that psychological pressure.
She would have taken the easy closure.
But what's fascinating here is how Robin demonstrates an extreme, almost superhuman tolerance for ambiguity. She adopts a flexible, open disposition.
She spends days and weeks meticulously gathering fragmented clues from abandoned ruined bases like Phi Robotics and Omega Lab.
She finds an audio log here, a PDA there, and she holds all of this conflicting, incomplete data in her mind without jumping to conclusions.
She sits in the discomfort of not knowing.
Yes, and we have to credit her pre-existing worldview for this. From the very beginning of the narrative, we know Robin had mixed feelings about Sam working for Altera.
She was already skeptical of corporate power structures.
And this skepticism acted as an immunological defense against what psychologists call normalcy bias.
The bias where you just assume everything is fine because the authorities tell you it's fine. We saw a lot of this during the early days of the pandemic, right?
It's a perfect example.
People assuming it wouldn't affect them because the brain wants to conserve energy by assuming tomorrow will be exactly like yesterday.
Exactly. Normalcy bias is a cognitive shortcut. It assumes the status quo will remain uninterrupted. In corporate control environments, this bias dooms whistleblowers and victims because the easiest path for the brain is to just trust the monolithic authority.
But because Robin expected Altera to be corrupt, she didn't fall into the trap of their official narrative.
She anticipated a cover-up.
Yeah.
That allowed her to weaponize the ambiguity. Instead of letting the informational void paralyze her with anxiety, she used it as an investigative roadmap.
Where there was silence, she knew to dig deeper. She uses the dread as a compass.
She really does.
But while she is managing this massive psychological chess match with Altera's ghost, she is simultaneously navigating the visceral, physical horrors of Sector Zero.
Right, the environment itself.
And I want to talk about the psychology of terror here and how humans attempt to make order out of chaos. In our source materials, we read this fantastic piece analyzing Gothic literature pioneer Anne Radcliffe's distinction between horror and terror.
It's a crucial distinction that applies perfectly to environmental psychology and game design.
Radcliffe wrote that horror freezes the soul. Horror is the jump scare. It's the monster bursting out of the closet.
It gives you a massive, instantaneous adrenaline spike.
Yeah, but it's cheap. It's a reflex. Once the monster's in front of you, the uncertainty is over. But terror. Radcliffe argued that terror actually expands the soul through imagination and dread.
Terror is what happens in your own head before you ever see the monster.
Exactly. Sector Zero is a masterclass in evoking terror.
How does that manifest for the listener if they were in Robin's shoes?
Well, imagine navigating the world. You experience kenophobia, the primal fear of wide, open, empty spaces, when you are swimming in the absolute void of the dark ocean, knowing there are Leviathans out there but not being able to see them.
That is deeply unsettling.
Then you deal with submechanophobia, the fear of partially or fully submerged man-made objects, when you're exploring the rusted, drowned, creaking wreckage of the Mercury 2 spaceship.
It feels like a tomb.
It really does. And then, when you finally get out of the water onto land, you have the constant ticking threat of freezing to death. The wind is howling, your visor is frosting over, and the temperature gauge on your wrist is dropping into the red. You never, ever feel safe.
That constant low-level dread is incredibly taxing on the human nervous system. Environmentally induced terror triggers what psychologist Daniel Goleman coined in 1995 as the amygdala hijack.
Let's look at the mechanics of that.
Okay, so the amygdala is the threat detection center deep in the brain's primitive limbic system. When you receive sensory information, say the distant, echoing roar of a chelicerated leviathan through the murky water, that information hits the thalamus.
And in a normal state, the thalamus sends that signal to the neocortex, the rational part of your brain, to evaluate it logically.
Is this roar a threat? How far away is it? What should my strategy be?
Exactly.
Right.
But under extreme emotional arousal, under terror, the thalamus routes the signal directly to the amygdala, bypassing the slower logical neocortex entirely.
The emotional brain attempts to hijack the entire nervous system. It floods your bloodstream with adrenaline and cortisol, reverting you to primitive fight, flight, or freeze responses.
And freezing in this environment is a death sentence.
Yeah.
Literally, if you freeze while you're freezing, you die.
This is why that S-stop-P theory we discussed earlier is so vital on a chemical level. By consciously choosing to sit, think, observe, and plan, Robin is performing a manual override of her parasympathetic nervous system.
When she stops and takes a breath, she lowers her heart rate.
That biological signal tells the amygdala to stand down, which allows blood flow to return to the prefrontal cortex, bringing her rational, problem-solving mind back online.
She has to repeatedly conquer her own neurobiology just to take the next step.
It's exhausting.
And there is a fascinating mythological connection in the sources that perfectly captures what Robin is doing on a macro level with this terror. It relates to the ancient Babylonian creation myth of Marduk and Tiamat.
Oh, this is such a good comparison.
Tiamat is this primordial goddess who represents the chaotic, monstrous, endless, unpredictable salt sea. She's the terrifying, formless unknown.
Right.
Marduk, the hero of the myth, defeats her, splits her body in half, and uses her remains to build the sky and the earth. He literally creates structure and order out of pure chaos.
It is one of humanity's oldest psychological metaphors for confronting the terrifying unknown.
And Robin literally reenacts this myth. Think about the frozen Leviathan. She finds this colossal, terrifying creature encased in ice that Sam was trying to cure.
This creature is the ultimate symbol of chaotic biological terror, a massive apex predator infected with a world-ending plague.
The easiest, safest thing to do would be to run away. Leave it frozen. Let Altera deal with it. But Robin doesn't retreat.
She ventures into the cave.
Right. She locates Sam's hidden antidote using the spy pangling, injects the Leviathan, and cures it. She neutralizes the plague. By doing this, she imposes order on the chaos. She finishes her sister's work, taking the terror of the unknown and rendering it safe. She's a Marduk.
She creates a psychological safe harbor in the environment by resolving the biological chaos. She tames the monster.
It's incredible.
But think about the mechanics of that for a second. It's one thing to impose order on a physical environment or a biological contagion, But this raises an incredibly important question.
What is it?
How does a human mind cope when the chaos isn't just in the ocean or in an icy cave, but literally inside their own head?
Oh, man. Here is where the deep dive gets profoundly weird and just absolutely fascinating.
It really does.
Because early in her journey, Robin picks up an SOS signal near a place called Sanctuary Zero. She investigates, assuming it's another survivor.
Naturally.
And through a massive misunderstanding of what a storage medium is, she accidentally allows a digitized alien consciousness. An ancient architect named Alan Toar download his entire being directly into her cerebral cortex.
It is the ultimate subversion of the traditional survival narrative.
Right. If you look at every survival movie or book, from Castaway to The Martian, the primary antagonist is extreme isolation.
Riley Robinson in the first game went weeks without hearing a voice.
Exactly. Robin, on the other hand, suddenly has a permanent, highly logical alien roommate living rent-free in her brain.
The psychological friction generated by this event is immense. You have to consider the fundamental differences in their cognitive architectures.
Right. Alan's species, the architects, operate on a collective, networked, highly logical framework.
They function closer to a hive mind of pure computation. They do not understand human emotional boundaries, individual autonomy, or the sheer inefficiency of organic data storage.
Suddenly, Robin is forced to articulate the most nuanced, complex human concepts, grief, bodily autonomy, morality, even sarcasm, to an entity that views the universe through cold, binary computation.
There is this specific moment in the lore where Alan tries to understand why Robin is grieving for Sam. From his perspective, Sam is dead, her data is lost, and grieving expends caloric energy with no tangible output.
He literally cannot process the utility of it.
He really can't. And Robin has to explain to him that grief isn't about utility, it's an expression of love persevering.
But if we look deeper into Alan's psychology, we realize he's not just an unfeeling calculator. He is burdened with an unfathomable amount of trauma and guilt.
We learn that over 1,000 years ago, Alan was a lead scientist stationed on 4546b, trying to synthesize a cure for the Cara bacterium.
Right, and he made a fatal error in judgment. He disobeyed the Architect Network's directives and tried to forcefully hatch sea dragon eggs at the disease research facility, hoping the enzymes from the babies would be the cure.
He thought it was the smartest guy in the room. Pure hubris.
Yes, and the consequences of his arrogance were apocalyptic. The mother sea dragon tracked her stolen eggs, rammed the facility, and destroyed it.
The Cara bacterium was released into the planet's ecosystem, which triggered an automated planetary quarantine.
But worse, the bacterium spread back to the Architect's core worlds. Alan's single decision led to the death of 143 billion of his people.
143 billion lives.
And he has been sitting alone, conscious, in a digitized sanctuary cube for over millennia, carrying the weight of that guilt.
I want the listener to just pause and try to wrap their head around that number. 143 billion. It breaks the human capacity for empathy.
It's just a statistic at that point.
But this is where the social psychology of survival comes into play. Studies of disaster scenarios, earthquakes, war zones show that helping others actually increases your own odds of survival.
Really?
Yes. Doctors, nurses, and leaders in crises often have higher survival rates because the act of giving care gives them a profound sense of purpose.
And Robin agrees to help Alan. She travels across the deadliest biomes on the planet to find the components, a synthetic skeleton, skin tissue, organs, at the fabricator base so he can build himself a new physical body and get out of her head.
But unconsciously, by helping him atone, Robin is engaging in her own grief therapy.
It is a profound mechanism of shared healing. You have two beings from entirely different corners of the universe, both deeply traumatized by the loss of their loved ones.
Robin's grief over her one sister is mirrored by Alan's grief over his entire civilization.
But wait, let me push back on this quite strongly.
Go ahead.
Because everything we've talked about so far regarding survival relies on maintaining a rigid, distinct identity. You have to know who you are to fight the environment. Doesn't having an alien mind merged with yours risk a total psychological collapse?
It's a valid concern.
You're already stressed, you're freezing, your amygdala is firing on all cylinders, and now you have a voice in your head questioning your every move and accessing your memories. How does Robin stay? Robin, why doesn't she just dissociate or become an extension of Alan's network?
I'd actually frame it slightly differently. While that level of cognitive intrusion would trigger a severe dissociative break in many individuals, for Robin, the friction of their differences actually acts as a reinforcement of her humanity.
Oh, so?
Think about it therapeutically. Because Alan constantly questions her human reactions, Robin cannot run on autopilot. She is forced to consciously process and articulate her internal states to an external observer.
Oh, wow. So she has to explain herself.
Constantly. She can't just repress her grief or let it fester in the dark. She has to put it into words so Alan can understand it.
That makes a lot of sense.
This constant internal dialogue serves as an involuntary form of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. In CBT, the goal is to identify and articulate your emotional responses to restructure your thought patterns.
By defining what makes her human to an alien, Robin is actively strengthening her own psychological boundaries.
She defines herself in opposition to his logic.
He becomes the ultimate sounding board. He forces her to process the trauma she came here to avoid. That is brilliant.
And that dynamic seamlessly transitions us to the climax of her psychological journey. Let's look at where the narrative brings her.
Okay.
With Sam's mission completed, the Kara cured, and the corporate cover-up exposed, and Alan's new physical body finally fabricated, Robin's original reasons for coming to 4546B are entirely resolved.
The mystery is solved. The biological threat is gone.
Logically, historically, the next step in any survival narrative is extraction. You signal for rescue, you go home.
But she doesn't go home to Earth. She hasn't returned to Altera space. She leaves her old life completely behind.
She does. And this decision is the ultimate textbook expression of post-traumatic growth, or PTG.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of PTG, because I think a lot of people conflate it with resilience.
They do, very often.
People always talk about resilience in the face of trauma, right? The idea is that you go through something incredibly hard, you get stretched to your limits, but eventually you bounce back to the shape you were before, like a rubber band snapping back into place.
Yes, resilience is fundamentally about returning to baseline. It's about surviving without permanent damage. But post-traumatic growth is emphatically not resilience.
It's something more.
It is a complete, irreversible transformation. Tedeschi and Calhoun, the researchers who developed the model in the mid-90s, noted that severe traumatic experiences often force an individual to completely reevaluate their core beliefs about the world.
The trauma acts as an earthquake that shatters their previous worldview, their understanding of safety, justice, or their own capabilities.
And in the agonizing process of rebuilding that worldview from the rubble, they developed into something entirely new. You don't bounce back like a rubber band. You transform like a caterpillar into a butterfly.
You cannot go back to being a caterpillar.
Exactly. The source materials outline 5 specific domains where post-traumatic growth manifests: a greater appreciation of life, deeper relationships with others, a newfound sense of personal strength, spiritual or philosophical change, and the discovery of new possibilities in life.
Robin hits every single one of these domains during her time in Sector Zero.
She absolutely does. And it is that final domain, the discovery of new possibilities, that drives her final radical choice.
To fully grasp this, we have to look at the philosophy of anxiety. The article from Aeon magazine that we reviewed heavily references Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century existentialist philosopher.
Kierkegaard argued that anxiety is fundamentally misunderstood by modern society.
We view it as a pathology, something to be medicated or cured.
But Kierkegaard argued that anxiety is the fundamental human response to our own freedom. He famously called it the dizziness of freedom.
I'm anxious, therefore I inquire. That quote stuck with me.
It's profound. Anxiety is the engine of philosophy and exploration. When we stand on the edge of an unknown future, we feel anxiety not because we are broken, but because we are utterly free to choose our path. We have to take responsibility for our choices.
Let's look at the climax of the game with that in mind. Robin arrives at the ancient architect Phase Gate facility with Alan, who is now in his new physical body.
He powers up the machinery and opens a portal across the galaxy to his homeworld.
But as they stand on the precipice, Alan hesitates. He is paralyzed by terror.
For 1,000 years, he hasn't known if any of his people survived the Kara outbreak he caused. He doesn't know if he's returning to a thriving civilization or graveyard of his own making. The ambiguity is crushing him.
And think about the role reversal here. Robin, the fragile, organic human who has spent this entire deep dive freezing, starving, mastering her terror, navigating corporate gaslighting, and slaying literal Leviathans, she steps up.
She helps him overcome his fear.
She tells him that whatever is on the other side of that portal, whatever consequences wait for him, they will face it together. Alan, this ancient hyperlogical being, follows Robin's human lead.
He sets aside his fear and lets hope guide his actions.
And they step through the phase gate together, leaving everything behind, leaping into the cosmos.
It is a phenomenal resolution.
So when we step back and look at the entirety of this deep dive, what does this all mean for us? Look at the sheer scale of the arc here.
It's massive.
Robin starts her journey crawling in the freezing dirt of Sector Zero, a grieving, desperate sister just looking for a tiny bit of closure, fighting against a cold, corporate lie. And she ends as a pioneer, leaping into an unknown galaxy side by side with an alien.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of survival psychology, it fundamentally redefines what the word survival actually means.
Right. In the traditional biological sense, survival is simply staying alive until the rescue chopper arrives, so you can go back to your comfortable, predictable old life.
But Robin's story suggests that true survival isn't just about outlasting the harsh environment. Sometimes survival means allowing the crucible of the extreme experience to melt you down and forge you into a completely new kind of entity.
She didn't just survive Planet 4546b, she outgrew it entirely.
She let the trauma transform her rather than break her. It's an incredibly powerful narrative to carry with you.
I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this really emotional, complex journey through the ice and the mind of Robin Ayou. If there is one thing her intentional plunge into danger proves, it is that a genuine search for meaning, a search for the truth, can generate enough psychological heat to outlast even the coldest, most unforgiving environments in the universe.
But it requires a profound tolerance for ambiguity. You have to be willing to let your anxieties drive you toward discovery rather than letting them paralyze you in despair.
Next time, we are reaching the final frontier of our series. We will be looking at the cutting-edge neuroscience and the very real psychological traps built into the upcoming Subnautica 2.
That is going to be intense.
We're going to dive into how the developers used AI in the new game. It is going to be a mind-bending exploration of isolation, and you absolutely won't want to miss it.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to consider, building on what we've discussed today.
Let's hear it.
Robin survived her unbelievable ordeal by literally sharing her mind, her most intimate, private, psychological space with an alien entity. In our modern world where trauma so often traps us in isolation, where we build massive emotional walls to protect ourselves from being hurt again, what if the ultimate evolutionary step for human psychological recovery isn't learning to heal ourselves in a vacuum? What if true healing requires learning how to truly merge our consciousness, our burdens, and our grief with someone completely different from us? Think about that the next time you feel completely alone in your struggles.
That is a lot to think about. Until next time, remember that the diagnostic muddy waters are where the real growth happens. Keep your X-ray machine broken, embrace the ambiguity, and keep diving deep.